Good morning and hello. I'm Bruce Weber, the Willem Quaker Dean of the Zicklin School of Business here at Baruch College, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to this episode of Zicklin Talks Business. The topic today is online scamming and its victims. In this session, Larry Zicklin, Baruch class of 1957, discusses this multi-billion-dollar global criminal enterprise with Alain, Claude, Tambe, Ebot, assistant professor in the Paul Chook Department of Information Systems and Statistics here at the Zicklin School of Business, and Volkan Topalli, professor of criminal justice and criminology at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. Alain received his PhD in information systems from the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. He teaches courses here at Baruch in cybersecurity, information technology strategy, and usability, privacy, and security. Volkan received his PhD in experimental social psychology from Tulane University in New Orleans. He specializes in crime policy, urban violence, and exponential crime. Alain, Volkan, and a colleague of theirs recently published a paper entitled Towards a Cyber Contextual Transmission Model for Online Scamming in the European Journal of Information Systems, which partially informs today's discussion. As always, our moderator is Larry Zicklin, former chairman of Neuberger Berman, an alum of the college and our school's namesake. Larry also teaches in our undergraduate honors program. Larry, I look forward to gaining insights from today's discussion, and with that, I'll hand it over to you, Larry.
Thank you very much. The title of your paper is so imposing. I want to assure our audience that I will simplify it because I would never understand it. So let's start with, is there a universal definition of what online scamming is? Volkan or Alain, either one of you? Do we all understand the same definition?
Well, I think there are many different types of scams, and it's best to not conflate them under one umbrella because advanced field fraud scamming, which is about exploiting people through social psychology, has several different sub themes within it. So you would have employment scams, pet scams, drug scams, and you also have romance scams, which I'm not sure is quite under the umbrella of advanced field fraud scams. So when we talk about online scams, we're just referring to just all these different categories of scams, but we're not saying they mean one thing.
But they all take place online?
No, I think unlike, say, hacking, scamming has been around for a very long time. And if you look at the literature, they'll trace it to the 18th century. They call it the Spanish prisoner scams. But what we are talking about is a scam those scams that emerged particularly from Nigeria, where they call the 419 scams, the Nigerian prince scams, and these scams have been traced to the 1980s, and I think anthropologists have associated these scams with the culture of the Nigerian government, a culture of corruption. And what you're saying is the citizens living in a resource-rich country, discovering that their leaders are so corrupt, learned how to engage in these kinds of scams. And in my own home country of Cameroon, whereas the Nigerians called it 419, we called it Femania. And when I was growing up, you would have these men in suits, in expensive suits with suitcases, looking for their victims in face-to-face scams. So if they learned that you've made a lot of money, because in Cameroon, the government would often pay its employees in arrears. So you work for about 1 to 2 years, and then they'll give you a lump sum. If they learned that you have just had money, they would approach you and promise to double your money. Basically, they have these chemicals in the suitcase, and you're told to not look at it after they've performed some kind of magic and to wait until 6 hours. By then, they've actually gone with your money and you're left with an empty box with old clothes and all. So scamming is an old crime. It's a crime that exists in the physical environment. It still does. Online scammers, some of them actually still engage in the physical face-to-face scams, but the one we're talking about is how it's morphed from these traditional forms to the online context.
I got it. And what's the dollar amount of this scamming? How big is it? Volkan, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's actually really difficult to calculate the numbers for a few reasons. We don't have, as we do with, sort of traditional crime, we don't have a uniform crime report or a national crime victimization survey for these kinds of scams, because most of the data about who's been scammed is actually held by banks or by mobile platform companies, that kind of thing. But there are estimates, and they are in the multiple billions. I think the last estimate I saw was something around 100 billion. But again, very hard to calculate because it's a worldwide crime, right? The offenders can be in Africa, the victims can be in the United States or the United Kingdom, the internet platforms can be based in China or Finland. So it's really, really difficult to have accurate data on these things, but it is in the multiple billions without a doubt.
It's certainly big.
Huge, yeah. And it's getting bigger and bigger every year.
And Alan, you mentioned Nigeria. My experience was I used to get calls from someone in Nigeria, and I thought this was Nigerian-based, but your studies in Cameroon. Has this business morphed from Nigeria to Cameroon now?
Oh, no, it's still in Nigeria. It's just that Cameroonians have also picked up. So I think when I was growing up, we didn't have that many scammers, but I was surprised how just over 10 years ago when I went home, a friend of mine told me, what we have nowadays is online scams. And I think a recent report by the Better Business Bureau was saying that most fraudulent links associated with scams come from Cameroon. And if you go there, it seems like it's this new thing that every youngster wants to engage in. A survey was done about 8 years ago in Cameroon among middle school children, and every one of them knew a friend who was under 15 who was also engaging in scamming. So it's become this generalized problem in Cameroon. I think most embassies, including the United States Embassy, would actually warn citizens that beware of pet scammers or beware of scammers.
And is it socially acceptable in Cameroon?
I don't think it's socially acceptable. I'm just not sure how people can handle it because unlike, say, the face-to-face scam, with online scamming, these offenders will practice their scams from private locations. When I interviewed them over 10 years ago, they relied on cyber cafes. But nowadays, cyber cafes are mostly a thing of the past. And so now they have the opportunity to tell me, well, I have my smartphone, everything's on my smartphone, and I'm at a bar, I can be scamming. Anywhere I can be scamming. And so they know that you can actually be a student and be a scammer. Now, most of them will also say, well, if I'm about 20-something and I'm not working, I'm not studying, but I have money, neighbors will start complaining that perhaps I'm a scammer. But often they will say, well, it's my life. So the scammers themselves have come up with these rationalizations to say, well, it's my life. I can do whatever I want to do with it. And even though it's not socially acceptable, they might also say, well, we're trying to fight or to avenge our ancestors. So they used to say, we were colonized by the West. They took away all our resources. So now we are just fighting back. Of course, they are not fighting back for their ancestors. They are just trying to make their own money.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to add just one thing that, kind of comes through when Alan is talking about this, and that is that these scams used to be very complicated and difficult to perpetrate because the technology was a lot clunkier, but most of them are perpetrated on social media platforms that we are all very familiar with. as social media platforms develop, the big thing is that you want to increase usability so that as many people as possible can use the platform. So Facebook is very easy to use, for example. WhatsApp is very easy to use. That's all to promote commerce, which is, of course, a positive thing. But it also means that more and more people can participate in these kinds of scams because the platforms are so easy to use and download. You don't have to be very technologically sort of competent to do them, and the processes that are involved can be sort of copied and pasted. So it's not surprising that this has been seen in Cameroon, and it's also seen in other countries as well. It used to be much more of a kind of a Nigerian kind of enterprise, but as Alain is mentioning, it's spread to Cameroon. We see it in South America now. We see it in East Asia, for example, because the tools are so easy to use at this point.
So technology is contributing to this. I'm saying
sorry?
technology is contributing to this.
Yeah, well, without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean,
and this is before AI. I'm assuming AI will magnify this.
Yeah, actually, I mean, some of the work that we're doing right now is to see if these processes will eventually be taken over by AI. We would, I think, probably 10 or 15 years ago, if we had told folks that artificial intelligence would be available now, they might have believed that that was true, but they would definitely not have believed that you could use it from your cell phone. And so implementing AI processes to help with, for example, doing deep fake photos of yourself, creating scripts that you can send out via email for scamming, even doing real-time conversations, doing these scams requires people to sort of, the scammers to interact with people over email. Well, if you can get an AI to do that for you, and if it's good enough to fake people into doing it, then instead of sending out a few emails, you can send out thousands at one time, and all with, basically the power of AI that you can get in your cell phone right now through ChatGPT 4.
So you don't even need language skills. You could probably use AI to substitute for language skills.
I would say in the next 3 to 4 years, the language skill barrier will be completely gone, because right now AIs are doing real-time translation anyhow. They can do voice capture and voice cloning. So there's no reason to believe that a scammer couldn't even in real time be speaking their own language to somebody on the phone, but actually have the AI doing translation and voice cloning at the same time so that it sounds like an American or a Brit or a woman or anyone else, for example. Yeah.
And does scamming become a career for these young people? You mentioned people under 15. Does this become their career?
I think most of them see it as a stepping stone. So they're hoping to make some money from scamming and then invest in a legitimate venture. I think recently, one of the top African under 30, he was listed by Forbes magazine. I think he was arrested by the FBI because he was actually a scammer, but he had also invested a lot in legitimate ventures. And most scammers tend to look up to such successful individuals. They claim that, well, I just want to make enough to invest in a legitimate venture. And I've actually found scammers who have invested in legitimate venture. I know that in Cameroon, we do have individuals who engage in these scams overseas, and then they return home and invest in real estate. So, but I'm not sure interviewing these younger ones who are, I would say, average scammers, how successful they can be, because they also claim that they have so many youngsters who are becoming scammers. They say it's bad for business because it means they are not as good as they should be. Victims become more aware of the tactics, and then it means making enough money to leave scamming challenging. So at the end of the day, they have this revolving door where you're a scammer for a couple of years. When things get extremely tough, maybe you stop for a bit, and then when things get tough again, you come back. And the reason is that technology, I think, makes the process of transitioning in and out of scamming much easier. So, and scammers will learn just pet scam and simply translate their skills to different kinds of advanced fee fraud scams. So it's really hard. I think as a career, I'm not sure, but they see it more as a way out.
And how much is the average amount that a scammer makes on a transaction, a single transaction? Is there such a number that we know?
I think it varies because for scammers, they are selling merchandise that doesn't exist. So they'll tell you any amount matters. It doesn't matter the amount. So it can be as low as little as $10, but it can also be a lot. I know that some scammers have made close to, I would say, they could make 5,000 upwards in dollars, but it's often rare. Most scammers earn their living through small amounts, say under $100 or so. So but for them it makes sense because you're selling something that you don't have in the first place.
And does scamming come about from poor countries, poor people in poor countries trying to make some money off rich people in rich countries? Is that the theory?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, the sociologists actually who went to Africa, there was a study from Ghana where this sociologist was saying, well, that actually is the case. It's because these people in these poor countries now have access to technology. But then most of the individuals in these poor African countries are not offenders. They are not engaging in this criminality, and they also need money. So perhaps there is something else. And I think for most of those who become scammers, it's also an attraction to the lifestyle where you see your friends engaging, friends who used to be broke in your community. After a while, they have a lot of money and they're spending in nightclubs, and you just become attracted to that lifestyle of extravagance and popularity. So I don't think it's because people in these African countries are poor. I just think, yeah.
So it sounds like you scam, you make some money, you spend some money, and then you need to scam again.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. And after you've spent the money, you start saying that, well, I intend to invest. So scammers have all these plans, and these plans are always great after they've spent the money. So once they have the money, they tell you, well, as soon as I have this money, I just want to live my life. I just want to make some noise. I want to spend it. And as soon as the money is finished, it takes about a week. And I mean, if you go to Cameroon and a scammer has actually hit, you will know, because they do make a lot of noise in the towns. So they want everyone to know. After that, they're just beggars.
Volkan, this is more up your alley. I understand the money part. Do scammers want anything else other than money? Is there something else that gives them a sense of worth, self-worth, or self-satisfaction?
Yeah. So there is a sort of a sense of self-efficacy that comes from this, knowing that you're able to do something with skill and accomplish something, getting over on somebody, particularly if they come from a country that's, full of educated and wealthy people. There's a sense of, sort of a David and Goliath kind of a mentality that goes along with that. So, and it's important to remember that money in and of itself is a motivator, but it's not the money really. It's what can the money get you? And as Alain mentioned, there's a whole kind of social side to this where having the money gives you the freedom to spend it, to show off with it, to enjoy it, to have fun with it. So these are very important things for people who come from impoverished areas, and that's no different than what we see with street offenders here in the United States, for example, who that cycle, it's sort of what we call an ideological cycle of criminality, basically, where you get money, you spend it very, very fast, then you're desperate for money, so you go and commit a crime to get more money, and then you've got the money again. So then what do you do with it? You party all over again. You go through the money, and then it becomes this kind of a vicious cycle. So there are these sort of notions that I'll put the money aside, I'll save it up, and once I have enough, I'll quit this life. But it's a very seductive lifestyle, to be able to blow money, in the moment and then go back out there and get some more. So it's actually not the case that most of them get out of that lifestyle until they've been caught or until something else forces them to quit. But, the money, like I said, it provides a lifestyle, and it also gives them a sense of accomplishment in some ways.
One of these days we'll have financial planners for scammers. That's
Right.
for a different day. What products or services are the scammers selling now? At one point, it was, money in a bank that they couldn't get out. Now I read about pets, I read about love, I read about sexting. What are they doing? What's current?
I think previously, 10 years ago in Cameroon, for instance, it was pet scamming. Everyone was engaged in pet scamming. Nowadays, they've discovered
What's a pet scam?
a pet scam is basically someone posts an advert on Facebook, on Instagram, that they supply pets, and these pets are not being sold typically. They are being offered for free. So they present themselves as a shelter, and they have these stray pets that need a home. And if you are a pet lover, you are invited to take one. You simply have to pay for the transportation. So the issue with the pet scam is, I think over the years, victims have become more aware. We've had a lot of public announcements about pet scams. And so scammers will say, it's really hard these days to convince someone that they are a legitimate supplier of pets. So most of them have moved to drug scams, where they say most of their victims themselves are criminals or engaging in an illegal activity. So
does that help them rationalize the scam? That the guy I'm
yes,
victimizing
actually it
also
does. Yeah, it does, because I think one of the challenges they faced with pet scam was that each time they victimize someone, they would get a letter from the victim explaining why they needed the pet, maybe for a child or for the family. And so they would say, well, I felt really bad, but I didn't quite have a choice. However, with the drug scammers, they will say, well, I'm actually helping them. I'm pretending to be selling drugs, but as soon as I get the money, I block them. And these guys themselves are bad people, because drug is bad for you and so on. So it's an easy way to make money without all the emotional guilt that comes with it. And
It's also the case that if someone's been pet scammed, they could complain to the authorities in some way, or file a police report, perhaps. I mean, not that those go very far, but with a drug scam, most of those take place on the dark net. And it's not the case that people who buy drugs will go to the police to say that someone stole my drugs and I'd like to file a report, obviously. So there's a bit of protection in scamming those kinds of individuals.
I would also assume there's a bit of shame in being scammed. You feel foolish that you've been scammed. And my guess is you don't report it because you're embarrassed to admit it.
That's actually a major problem. We call this the dark figure of crime. So these are crimes that take place that the police don't become aware of, and that therefore don't enter into our data about what kinds of crimes are taking place. And you're right, there is a bit of embarrassment at having been had. Alain mentioned pet scams and drug scams. There's also romance scams, where individuals convince people that they'll establish a kind of a romantic relationship with them, and then use an advanced fee fraud scam to get money out of that person. So I'm in love with you, I want to come visit you, but I need $500 to pay for my visa. Can you send me the $500? Or I need $700 for a plane ticket. Can you please send me the money for the plane ticket? And then they use that scam. Well, if you've been scammed in that way, it could be very embarrassing to admit that you'd been duped by somebody into believing that they were in love with you and that you gave them money. So you're absolutely right. Those kinds of crimes don't even get counted.
Can I assume in romantic scams, the people that are most vulnerable are the people that have suffered some sort of cataclysmic event in their lives? A spouse passed away, or a spouse is sick, or a romantic relationship went bad.
Yeah. So there are profiles of what we would call at-risk individuals or vulnerable individuals, and it does tend to be people who are a little bit older in life, not always, but a little bit older in life. Very common to have people who have been divorced, who've been widowed, for example. And a lot of the information about them is online. It's not hard to find out if someone's divorced. It's not hard to find out if they've been widowed, for example. You can go into public records to identify victims, and the scammers that engage in these scams will do that. They will contact people because they know about this background. And it's a shotgun approach in the sense that, you could send 100 emails out, and if you get 10 or 15 people who respond to the email, then you've now captured a pool of people who are even willing to communicate with you. You keep talking to them. Eventually, you can narrow it down to 4 or 5 people. So these guys will scam 4 or 5 people at a time to impose an advance fee fraud scam on them. And they do tend to be vulnerable people who also won't report the crime because they're embarrassed when they've been had.
And I
of
think
course-
this
I'm
idea
sorry,
of, yeah, I was going to say that this idea of victims feeling shame or being called stupid, perhaps we need to also blame academics, because if you look at the literature, a lot of it, especially the early literature, basically framed victims as gullible, as stupid, as greedy. And so people generally will feel embarrassed to report the crime, which in the long run, I think, helps the scammers.
Do women engage in scamming? I've only heard men.
Yes. Actually, I interviewed just one lady, but I think women would engage in scamming, especially in context of romance scams. So I don't think it's something which the offenders have interacted with engaging a lot, because most of them are men. But if they're engaging in a romance scam, they would have a woman acting as an accomplice. So especially if the victim is a man and wants to actually see the woman, then they'll bring her on video. So in this case, it's not just one individual operating, it's actually 2.
That's amazing. And there's so much information out there that provides fodder for these scammers. I'm just thinking as you were talking about the obituary pages. You look at the obituary pages and you see everybody's lost a spouse, a child, a parent.
Well, that's going to be accelerated in the future, because now scammers will use, for example, artificial intelligence to scrape the web, and you'll give an AI a certain set of inclusion criteria for potential victims, and say, go ahead and identify everybody from this country who, has lost a spouse in the last 3 years, who's female, over the age of 45, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of this was done by the scammer. The scammer would have to go and do the homework, so to speak. Now you can actually have a machine learning process and an algorithm figure that out and just provide you with, here's a set of 180 or 1,080 potential victims. So it's going to get easier to do these things, not harder.
Is organized crime involved in scamming? Or is this too small for them?
Alan?
I think I doubt it. Perhaps in Nigeria, because they are very advanced in scams. But I think typically scammers prefer to operate on their own, but socialize informally with other scammers to learn new ideas. But as an organized crime, the instances where I've heard scammers coming together to, no, I don't think so. Generally, I just think it's a loose network of offenders who actually know each other, who respect each other, who learn from each other, but then go on to scam individually.
It is, I would say, I agree that it's not a what we consider like a mobster kind of crime, but it has become corporatized in some instances. So they have these call centers in India and certain parts of East Asia where groups of individuals, I mean, we would sort of loosely refer to them as a gang, but they're very corporatized, right? They have an office, they have cubicles, they run their scams as a group of individuals. So we do have that kind of thing. And now we have companies and corporations that are actually operating scams at a kind of a higher level using sort of customer service enterprise software to run some scam. But it's not a mobster syndicate kind of activity in the traditional sense.
But an entrepreneur will actually open a call center knowing full well that this call center will be populated by scammers.
Yes. So in India, there are a number of these actually, and they operate almost as legitimate businesses. And if you go on YouTube, you can see tons of videos of these guys sort of perpetrating these crimes where they're trying to get people, they'll pose as the credit card company, try to get your credit card information. They'll pose as your bank, try to get your, your password to get into your bank account, transfer funds to you. But there are now companies that sort of have one foot in the legitimate world and one foot outside in the sort of the more criminal world, where they use the customer service management software and the enterprise software that they have to help companies that do sort of sexting scams. And these aren't technically scams because people know that they're willingly engaging in these sexting sessions with others where you pay 99 cents per text message that you send, for example. But the company is basically using their technology to help the sexting company create scammers that look like someone that you would want to sext with. And then they're sort of accelerating that technology in order to do it. So those companies, they're based in, some of them are based in Europe, some of them are based in Eastern Europe. And they serve thousands and thousands of clients. And their workers actually work mostly in poorer countries, Africa, Asia, East Asia, places like that. And some of that's not exactly advanced fee fraud scamming, the kind of offense that we're talking about today, but it's a similar kind of the use of deception to convince somebody to part with their money. In this case, it's through sexting. In other cases, it could be to get your bank information, for example.
So if you know about this, and Alain knows about this, I assume the governments know about these centers. What is the government reaction? What are the regulators thinking about all this?
Which regulators?
Well, in the various countries.
Yeah, that's the problem. The problem
take India. If there were sexting centers, any kind of sexting centers.
Well, there's a couple issues. One is that when these centers exist in countries, they many governments see them as producing tax dollars for their coffers as a way. This is employment for the people who live in these countries, and so you have jurisdictional issues here. Of course, in the United States, the FBI and the FTC and some of these other organizations are very unhappy about this. But they have to negotiate with governments to sort of say, hey, these guys are doing this to our citizens. You need to go ahead and arrest them or take care of them or get rid of them or whatever it is. And governments are resistant to do that in many cases. They might do it, a few times just to sort of satisfy the US government. But in general, they're really not incentivized to prevent this kind of thing from happening because it's bringing money into their country from outside. And so any flow of funds into the country it's going to be hard to convince them to stop doing this. And the jurisdictional issues make it really, really difficult because the scammers are in one country, the IT companies in another country, the victim is in Georgia, but the bank that they are with is in, let's say, North Carolina. So who's the victim? Who do you prosecute? Who's the authority in these things? It becomes extremely complex.
And it seems to me, based on my own experience, which I'll describe to you, that this imposes a cost on normal businesses. And the reason I say that is I recently got a letter from the controller of the state of New York about some money that the controller's office said I had someplace, and I figured it was a scam. And but it looked real because it had the controller's logo, and I checked the spelling, and it was all clean. And we called the controllers, did all this kind of background. It took 2 weeks until we finally determined it was real, and we got $28. It turned out, but it held up the process for weeks because everybody thinks they're being scammed, and nobody pays attention to anything.
Yeah,
is that fair?
People are definitely erring on the side of being more cautious. It slows down the gears of commerce. There's no doubt about that. It forces companies and corporations to impose all kinds of internal security features. The reason why you have to do dual authentication to get into your web, your bank account, for example, the reason why you have to, get a code on your phone, for example, to do any transaction these days, all these things slow down the process of commerce, make it inconvenient. And they also make it very likely that people will skip over these things because they get tired of them. If you have to keep on authenticating over and over and over and over again, and it never really results in you identifying a potential scam, you might decide, well, I'm going to go ahead and skip doing this. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't get scammed anyhow. And so there is a definite, I'm sure there's an economist out there that's calculated some sort of cost benefit analysis to the existence of these scams. And my guess is that in addition to the losses that we see with victims, there's also a huge cost to commerce and to the people and to the companies that do commerce. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I was going to add that I think early studies, there was a study already in 2005, the Nigerian government had a collaboration with Microsoft to help them identify scammers. I'm not sure how they intended to do that, but the motivation was simply that Western businesses were scared of operating in Nigeria because of all the scams. And there was another study out of the Caribbean. So I think it's having a negative impact on businesses in these African countries. But the scammers see it differently. They see themselves as bringing in foreign income, like Volkan said.
Yeah.
When you do a study, I'm assuming most studies create new knowledge. How is this new knowledge that you've created used? Do governments look at this and say, now that we understand this, we have to do the following? Do foreign governments look at this and say, well, we can impose some costs on these folks by putting a charge on all these emails that are going out or text messages? What has been the result of your study, if any?
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that even though scamming is such a global problem, we do have very few studies on online scammers. So most of the studies that we know do come from, well, just reports from journalists or news magazines. And basically, our research wanted to understand the motivations of offenders, because the idea in the literature was that, the internet is just context, and that traditional scam is the same as online scam, and therefore the motivation to be an online offender is the same as that for traditional offenders. So we focused more on why do these individuals become scammers in the first place. And in that context, I think we reported that, well, the learning process itself is the same in many respects, but IT plays a different role. It facilitates the process. It makes scammers actually think differently about this criminality. Notice that the victims, to most of them, are just text on their screens. They don't actually see them as people. They just see them as pieces of information. So they can easily distance themselves from these individuals and claim that, well, these victims actually have money anyway because they are in the West. But they also see scamming differently in the sense that IT allows them to be anonymous online. So we asked offenders, would you engage in scamming if the internet did not exist? And most of them said, I don't think I could do it in a face-to-face context. So our goal was to understand what motivates people to operate in online scamming in the first place.
So they can't do it face-to-face because they would feel guilt if they actually saw the person? This sounds like the Milgram experiments.
It is like
well, yeah, because I think when they started talking about their victims, they did not humanize them. They just talked about them as these far away entities, or I would say more text on their screens. They didn't see them as human beings. And when I think in pet scamming, most of those who got to know about the victims started thinking about scamming differently, because they'll tell us that, well, I discovered that the victims are just people like us, that they have their own struggles and so on, and they wanted a pet simply because they had a sick child and so on. Yet, online scamming as opposed to face-to-face scamming is different, because in many instances, they can choose to not know who the victims are. And in many ways, it helps them psychologically, because scammers will tell you they do experience guilt, a lot of it. They sometimes would rely on alcohol to cope, but the fact that they do not know you as a victim makes the process of coping much easier.
And that has implications for prevention policy. If you're trying to inform prevention programs, for example, or intervention programs, for example, it's really important to understand not just the motivations, but what are the things that introduce guilt? What are the things that sort of remove guilt before you commit the offense, as well as after you commit the offense? Prevention programs, for example, if you take a public health model, the idea would be that you would implement programs that would remind scammers that, hey, when you do this, you're harming elderly people, you're harming people who look just like you, you're taking money from people who may not be able to afford the money that they're giving up, that kind of thing, in the hopes that those scammers that are vulnerable to those kinds of feelings would decide that, well, this is going to dissuade me from doing this. And so there are public service campaigns that operate and rely on the kind of research that Alain does to formulate their messaging, for example. And some of them can be very successful, actually.
I've just finished reading a book about Vietnam. And in the book, the author, historian, interviews some B-52 bomber pilots.
Yeah.
The B-52 bomber pilots never equated what they were doing in dropping bombs to people on the ground that were being blown up.
Right.
They didn't make that association.
So this is something that the psychologist Albert Bandura has discussed, sociologists Gresham Syke and David Matza. The idea that, when you're contemplating doing something to somebody else that's bad or wrong, there's a way that you message to yourself. You engage in self-talk to say things like, well, I'm not bombing people, I'm servicing a target, I'm killing the enemy, whatever it is. You use language to sort of convince yourself that what you're about to do is not really that bad. And as a matter of fact, in the case of people in the military, they convince themselves that what they're doing is patriotic. You're by dropping these bombs, you may cause some damage on the ground, but you're also protecting people at home, that kind of thing. So the scammers do the same thing. They will contemplate that they're about to scam somebody who, well, maybe it's wrong to do this, maybe I shouldn't do this, but then they engage in a lot of self-talk to convince themselves that what they're doing is legitimate. Well, this person lives in a really rich country. They can afford to lose $50 or $60. Their ancestors may have done something to my ancestors. This is a country that colonized my country. I'm just getting back at them. And then you drift into this mentality or mindset where, actually doing this isn't a bad thing. And as a matter of fact, maybe it's kind of a good thing. I'm a kind of a Robin Hood, so to speak. That sort of preemptive, self-delusional guilt avoidance talk is something that all human beings do, but it's a very useful tool for individuals that are contemplating engaging in these kinds of crimes, especially scams, which are really about deceiving people, taking money away from them. So you do that kind of self-talk before, and then you also do it afterwards. I just took money from somebody. Oh, gee, I kind of feel bad about it, but you engage in the same kind of self-talk to make yourself feel okay so that you can go on and produce or perform the next offense. So that's definitely part of it. And we talk about that in the paper.
Of course, we do dehumanize these people in advance,
Absolutely.
rationalize what we do.
Yes.
I don't want to excuse the crime of cybercrime. I understand it's a crime. But I look at these people, now that I've had this conversation with you, as entrepreneurs. These are folks that my guess is are reading the newspapers, see opportunities, translate those opportunities into ways to better themselves. They're probably looking at Bitcoin right now, which is roughly $70,000 per coin, and saying to themselves, Now there's a good market for us. All we have to do is figure out how to do this thing.
Right. They are entrepreneurial. There's no doubt. Yeah, there's no doubt. It is a form of entrepreneurialism because the thing that you have to, I think that we all have to remember is that the messaging that we give to the entire population is work hard, go to school, pay your taxes, and that is the way that you will get what? These rewards that we also greatly value. Nice clothes, a car, a nice house, beautiful family, all these kinds of benefits. Well, if you come from a country where those means, in other words, going to school and paying your taxes, won't get you there, you're going to innovate. You're going to say, well, I can't get it by following the rules, so I'm going to go ahead and break the rules because I want the same things that everyone else does. I want to have a nice car. I want to have nice clothes. I want to have nice jewelry. But the means to do so are not available to me because I live in a poor country. I live in a place where there isn't education readily available. So I'm going to innovate. I'm going to find a way to get to the same place that everyone else around the world is trying to get to as well. And so it is entrepreneurialism because they're identifying new routes to making money that didn't exist before. The only difference is that for them, it's illegal.
Yeah, and I think when you talk to scammers and ask them how they come up with all these new ideas, they'll tell you that, well, it depends on what is selling in the market. So they do have accomplices around the globe, and their friends would tell them these scams make sense nowadays. And when they frame their scams to tell you, I want my profile on Instagram or on Facebook to look as professional as possible. So they see themselves as business people, and they want you to understand that what you're looking at from their profile is that of a legitimate supplier.
So they think of themselves as business people.
Yeah, they know that it's
because they're using business techniques.
Yeah.
They're using Facebook, they're using sophisticated analysis of potential victims.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are smart people. They're highly motivated. I mean, I would dare to say that, in another context, these would be the exact kinds of people that you would want to have as interns in your company. They're motivated, hardworking, innovate, they're smart. Yeah. They just don't have the opportunity.
Yeah, and they're extremely confident. I think the one thing that separates experienced scammers from the less experienced ones will tell you is the confidence to talk to someone as convincingly as possible.
Right.
Gwen, you look like you have some questions from our audience.
Yes, there are quite a few questions, and I'm eager to get into them. The first one I want to start with, actually, a similar question was asked by two people, so I want to pose both of them to you together. If a scamming victim overcomes the embarrassment they feel and disputes the charges incurred, how do the financial institutions or MasterCard, Visa typically respond? And have they got any recoveries? But another listener expanded on that basically. Are there any international law enforcement programs that work to shut these call centers or even individual scammers down? And what are the technology companies doing to combat any of this? And are they actually potentially able to leverage AI?
Do you want me to take that one, Alan?
Okay.
So one of the things that I complained about earlier was that we don't have a lot of good statistics on how many people have been scammed, how much money's been taken, et cetera. Part of the reason for that is that the financial institutions will often cover the losses, especially if they're not particularly great. So when someone has stolen your credit card information and used it illegally, you often find out about it from the credit card company. They call you and say your card was, did you buy 600 gallons worth of, unleaded fuel in Pennsylvania? And you say, well, no, that wasn't me. They say, don't worry about it. We're going to wipe it off your card. We're going to send you a brand new card. That statistic never gets to the FBI. It never gets to the police because you didn't call the police to deal with it. The company dealt with it on their own. And therefore, it's sort of part of that dark figure of crime that I was talking about. So in most cases where the scams are for very small amounts of money, financial institutions will simply wipe it off the books. And they're insured for that kind of thing. As a matter of fact, one of my students is now the senior vice president for cybersecurity for a mobile payments company. And he said, anything under $1,000, we don't even bother with it. And he said between 1,000 and 100,000, if it happens over and over again, we might sent an investigation team, and he said, really, it's over 1 million that we're worried about. So the amounts of money are so small that it doesn't, and the amount of effort that it would take to police this would be tough. There are jurisdictional issues that I mentioned before. So the idea of Interpol doing a raid on a call center in India, those kinds of things don't generally happen. We rely on the governments, on the U.S. State Department essentially putting pressure on governments to, hey, we want that call center shut down. And that'll happen on occasion, but they usually pop right back up again. The idea of using AI to identify these things is new, and I think that Microsoft, in particular, Microsoft and IBM are the two companies that I would say are really pursuing the use of AI to detect these kinds of offenses and sort of thwart them before they even become, before even people become aware of it. But they need partnership with the social media platforms, so they need WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, to allow them to sort of have access to the communication platform in order to make sure that you can thwart it before something bad happens, basically. So it's still a bit of the Wild West there. It's still in process.
And I think a challenge with artificial intelligence might be that offenders are framing their businesses as legitimate. So you would say what you see as a scam is what you would see from legitimate suppliers. So how then do you distinguish the legitimate supplier from the scammer? So I think that's a challenge for companies trying to fight scamming on social media.
All right, thank you both. And here's a question, probably for Alain, referring to your research through interviews. Is there honor among scammers, or will they scam each other? Do they steal from each other if they know someone has made a big score?
Yes, and I think scammers were mostly scared of other scammers if they had made a lot of money, because they felt that they would easily snitch on each other, especially because the law enforcement locally is corrupt, they would say. And so if they learned that another scammer has a big hit, they might work with law enforcement so that when you get the money, you're also arrested immediately. So scammers do not trust other scammers. But nowadays, I'm not so sure that it's a problem, because if the victim is in the United States, typically the payment is done via Zelle or Cash App to a local accomplice. And the other challenge is that some of the accomplices will simply take the money and just not send their share locally. So generally, scammers are mistrustful of other scammers when it comes to their money.
Gwen, can I interrupt for just a second? Are
Sure.
the victims typically older? Do the scammers try to take advantage of older people?
Aren't risk.
Perhaps it depends on the type of scam. I don't think when they frame their scams, they're looking at victims in terms of their age, but they just want to tell you that if it's a pet scam, they are looking for pet lovers. So they target that demographic. If it's romance scam, they want people seeking love and so on. So they're looking for people who are interested in what they have to offer, what they want to sell.
Yeah, there are extortion scams, for example, that focus entirely on teenagers. So they're combined with romance scams. So they'll convince the teenager that they're in love with them, then get the teenager to send a naked photo of themselves, and then they'll say, "I'm going to send this to everyone at your high school if you don't send me $100 or something like that." So it really does cover the gamut of everyone from teenagers all the way up to the elderly.
I've just heard a scam using AI where they can replicate a young person's voice so that the young person can say to their grandmother, "I'm in jail, I can't get out, I've got to post a $100 bond." And it's the typical voice of the teenager.
Yeah, because they're cloning the voice off of the teenagers' public postings of their own videos, for example, and it doesn't take more than about 9 or 10 minutes of video and about 15 minutes of audio to do a almost perfect a clone match to the voice and to the face, actually. So, and those are tools that you can download right now today on your phone to use.
I'm sorry, Gwen.
I'm not even here right now. This is not me.
Well, we hope it is you, Volkan. Here's a question. How do the governments of African countries most associated with scamming view the growth of scamming in their young people? Are they concerned about the diversion of talent to these areas? Are they able to do anything about it to encourage them to go legit?
To be honest, I've not seen any literature to suggest that these governments are actually interested in doing something. And I've been searching for, I don't think that, because if you look at it, perhaps it makes sense that these youngsters are engaging in this criminality because in the first place, they don't have jobs. The unemployment rates are actually high. And if the government might actually think that, well, perhaps it's a good thing that they have found other avenues to earn, to earn a living or to make money. But I cannot see in Cameroon, I don't think the government is doing anything. I understand that in Nigeria, they've been making some efforts, largely because they feel pressured by foreign businesses or foreign governments. I think locally in these African countries, if they have these sting operations between law enforcement from Western countries collaborating with local law enforcement, it's largely because the governments of these Western countries are putting pressure on them, not because they themselves want to effect a change.
Do young people in some of these countries regard the young people who are scammers as elevated in the social hierarchy?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so at all. I think if you ask them, they'll tell you that, well, we are largely the same, but perhaps when they have money, they can enjoy on a much larger scale. Because when you meet these scammers, you have to wonder why they do scamming in the first place. Often, most of them look broke. They don't look like they have any money, largely because, well, they've spent it all. And yes, they have a lifestyle, but it's just a one-off thing. So it happens sometimes. I've had scammers who told me, well, the last time I made money was about 3 months ago. Now I'm just depending on my friends or my relatives. And so I think most of them also feel, especially if they're not very successful, feel ashamed of themselves. I think scammers will tell you, I cannot marry from a good family because if I'm just a scammer, the family might not want to associate with someone who is a scammer and so on. So it's not something to be proud of locally.
We have time for just one last question. Larry, after this discussion, have you become less concerned or possibly more concerned about the risks of online scamming as far as the victims are concerned?
I'm far more concerned because I see the advances in technology aiding and abetting scamming. It's going to become more sophisticated. AI is going to contribute to this. I think governments are going to have to start addressing this thing before it gets out of hand. And perhaps it's already out of hand.
It is. Yeah.
It is.
Do you think it's out of hand already?
Yes. Yes.
I think the technology, I think Larry really hit it on the head. The technology is advancing so much faster than our capability to actually address it. So, you know, we think linearly, but the technology is actually advancing in an accelerated fashion. And so creating laws for what the problem is today won't help you with what's going on tomorrow. And creating laws is very, very slow. And so I think that it's quickly getting out of hand. I agree.
Yeah. And these offenders also have access to these technologies.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, I think we are out of time. We'll have to leave it there. I want to thank the three of you. It's a very interesting discussion, especially gauged by the number of questions that came in. I want to mention that the April webinar will be on the insurance industry and its potential role in helping us solve the climate change. Our guest will be Lynn Peng from our own finance department, the Krell Chair in Finance, and Alice Hill, the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. We are out of time, so I want to thank you, Alain, Ken, and Larry, for a really, really engaging conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Take
My
care.
pleasure.